Hi, my name is Amanda Baughan, and I'll be presenting a study that I completed as part of a Google research internship on behalf of my co-authors titled A Mixed Methods Approach to Understanding User Trust After Voice Assistant Failures. First, I want to start off by talking about why we might want to study voice assistant failures and user trust. Over the past 5 years, NLP models have seen huge gains in accuracy when tested against standardized datasets across tasks such as question answering and chat text generation. However, despite these gains, users still have frustrating experiences with voice assistants. For example, only 5% of voice assistant users report never being frustrated when conducting a voice search. Past research also shows that user trust is pivotal to user adoption of various technologies. Although voice assistants continuously expand their capabilities to increasingly complex functions, users may not benefit from these capabilities if they do not trust their voice assistants enough to try these capabilities out. As voice assistants can fail in a large variety of ways, we were curious if particular failures may impact user trust more than others. Therefore, we ask, which types of voice assistant failures do users currently experience, and how do these failures impact user trust? To answer these research questions, we conducted interviews with 12 voice assistant users to learn about past voice assistant failures and how they impacted their trust and their behavior in the aftermath. We conducted these interviews with adults in the US who spoke English as a native language. To further answer our research question about which types of voice assistant failures users are experiencing, we crowdsourced 199 failures from 107 voice assistant users. We have open sourced this data set, and then we used a subset of these failures in our survey. We executed this survey with 268 additional participants to evaluate the impact of voice assistant failures on user trust and their future willingness to use a voice assistant for various tasks. First, I'd like to discuss our data set to answer the question, which types of voice assistant failures do users currently experience? When we were evaluating this question, we wanted to first understand the existing literature. So we evaluated the existing data sets in HCI and NLP. In HCI, we found that past work evaluating voice assistant failures often relies on artificially constructed scenarios, which, while they make sense for the research questions at hand, were too narrowly scoped for our purposes. NLP datasets that are used for model training also rely on accurate data. So while we could train and test these models to find some failures, these did not encompass the full scope of possible failures that users experience with voice assistants. Therefore, we decided to crowdsource a dataset of failures from voice assistant users. To ensure that our dataset collection was as broad as possible, we used an existing taxonomy developed by Wang et al. In 2021, which categorizes NLP failures. We slightly adapted it for the use case of voice assistants specifically, and then we asked users to submit failures along these different categories, which I will briefly cover. These categories include 4 failure types, and within those 4 failure types, 12 different failure sources. The first of these is attention, which is failure to attend to a user's attempt to initiate communication or activate a voice assistant. A perception failure is a failure in capturing user input. An understanding failure is a failure to make sense of the semantic meaning of the input. And a response failure is a failure to respond accurately or complete the task requested. Within these failure types, there were failure sources. So for example, mistrigger failures would be a failure to activate when called, which falls under attention. Once we had collected failures from users, we cleaned the dataset by standardizing the format of the failures, and we qualitatively coded the failures that had been submitted to ensure that they were correctly categorized. The final dataset is now available on Kaggle. The failures that we received most often were due to misunderstanding, mistriggers, and noisy channels. Here we can see a few examples of the 12 different failure sources and how the dataset is structured, including the context for the failure, what the user said, and how the voice assistant responded. So in the case of a mistrigger, asking the voice assistant to set a timer for 10 minutes and not receiving any response. Or in the case of a spurious trigger, talking to a coworker, asking them to share a screen, and then having the voice assistant interrupt that conversation saying, let me help you with that. Once we had an understanding of the types of failures that users were experiencing, we wanted to understand how these failures impact user trust. And to do so, we executed the interview and the survey. In the survey, we wanted to measure trust across 3 different dimensions, including ability, benevolence, and integrity, because these different measurements have been found to explain a large portion of perceived trustworthiness. So is this voice assistant capable of accurately responding to commands? Is it designed to satisfy the commands its users give? And will it not cause harm to its users? We asked participants how much they were confident in each of these statements after each of the 12 failures. Here we can see on the y-axis the average confidence that users reported, and on the x-axis each of the trust dimensions of ability, benevolence, and integrity, and the bar chart of the failure type: attention, perception, understanding, and response. What we found is that people overall tended to be more trusting after failures due to attention and understanding than those due to perception and response. To break this down into a little bit more detail, here we have the same graph, but rather than failure type, we see the 12 failure sources. So if you looked at the leftmost grouping per trust dimension, you'll see the failures due to attention. And here we can see that spurious triggers were generally maintaining a higher level of user trust after a failure compared to those due to mistriggers. Participant 12 said that spurious triggers were irritating but funny at the same time. They said they were funny because sometimes, like when you're usually calling the voice assistant, she'll take a longer time to respond. But when you're not talking to it, it automatically pops up. Like, I'm not talking to you, but you could answer me when I'm talking to you. Finally, as a part of understanding the impact of failures on user trust, we were curious to see how trust translates into future use of the voice assistant. To answer this question, in the survey, we asked participants how much they would be willing to trust their voice assistant to play a song, text a coworker, and transfer money after each failure. In interviews, we asked participants how they use their voice assistants after a failure. What we find is that trust is rebuilt over time and across different types of tasks. In particular, perceptions of the ability of the voice assistant impacts future use. Additionally, people rebuild their trust by asking the voice assistant to do different tasks than the one that resulted in a failure. So for instance, people might trust their voice assistant to play music or set timers, even though they just experienced a failure with sending a text message. Over time, as participants see that they can rely on their voice assistant for these different tasks, they might then resume the task that they had experienced a failure in. He too illustrates this by saying, you kind of build up that trust. So after experiencing a failure due to sending a text message, this participant says, the next couple of times I would go into my contacts and hit the button myself, and then like if I had been walking to my car and had my keys in my hand, it's been a while, so let me try this again. Like, I think that's something where you just have to like build that trust back up and give it another try. At least that's what I do. In summary, we contribute a crowdsourced dataset detailing the 199 failures that users experience across 12 different categories. We find through interviews and a survey that these failures have a differential impact on user trust, with failures such as those due to spurious triggers being more easily forgiven and maintaining a higher level of user trust than those due to mistriggers. Finally, after a failure, we find that people use voice assistants for other tasks unrelated to the failure, and over time can resume their former use of the voice assistant. Thank you so much for listening.